You know, I have to tell you a little story. Well, the whole evening's going to be a story. And I think what I hope by the end of the evening, you're going to be shaking your head is, I didn't know our history was like this. They never taught me this in school. And you know, I worked at Montpelier for 8 years. Both my wife and I did that. And that was a very special occasion because here is the home that one of our very precious founders really became the father of our Constitution and the fourth President of the United States. I was able to go from room to room in the very house that he lived in. And that was a very special occasion. In addition, we had visitors from all over the world coming to see his home. And I had the opportunity and actually the pleasure of telling them about the life of James and Dolly and how he got to become the father of the Constitution. So what I wanted to do tonight is tell you some of the things. You know, whenever the people arrived, I would tell them, I have this much to tell you, but they only gave me this much time to do it. So I welcome questions. And tonight, I'm going to give you an opportunity to have questions as well. So what I'd like to do is go through part of my lecture. We're going to take a break about an hour from now, and before that, we'll have a break where you can ask me questions. So if you've got questions, keep them in mind. And be ready to ask them before we go into our break. Because I know there's probably things that are on your mind you'd like to ask, but I'd like to continue the flow of the story. So let's start off by talking about James in particular. James was born in Port Conway, Virginia, right along the Rappahannock River, just outside of Fredericksburg, Virginia. His mother, Nellie, was 20 years old. He was her firstborn child. He was born on March 16, 1751. She went on to have 11 more children, a total of 12 children. Unfortunately, during that time, a number of them died in childbirth, and some died a little later from dysentery and things of that nature. So only 7, including James, lived to be adults. So he had 3 brothers and 3 sisters. Now get this, he was born in 1751. His mother, after having 12 children, lived to be 97 years of age. I mean, we marvel at people today with the modern medical challenges, but they didn't have all that back then, but she was able to live that long. She lived a very full life as well. So, after he was born, his father owned a 5,000-acre tobacco plantation called Montpelier. It's in Orange, Virginia, not too far, actually some distance from Fredericksburg. And that's where he and his brothers and sisters lived until the age of 11. Now, what was he doing there? Well, there were no schools nearby, so he was homeschooled by his mother and his grandmother till he was 11 years of age. And he was a great student. He was a small boy. He also had some health issues as well. He had something he called bilious fever, which we're not sure exactly what that was, but it was a disabling disease that was similar to epilepsy. And so we're going to talk about some of the episodes that he had over the course of his life, and we'll explain why he was suffering. But that's part of the story we're going to get into. So, but he was an avid reader. At the age of 11, he was sent away to a boarding school. Dr. Donald Robertson. He was a Scottish Presbyterian pastor and he was there for 5 years, and he was a really good student. And at the end of the 5 years of the boarding school, he could read and write, not speak, but read and write in 5 languages, including English, Latin, Greek, Italian, and French. So he returned home at the age of 16. And they were trying to prepare him for college. He had a resident tutor. His parents brought in an Anglican pastor by the name of Thomas Martin, and he was tutoring James and his brothers and sisters, particularly James, to get him ready for college. Now, this is Virginia, the college of choice for most Virginians. including Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, John White, and so on and so forth, was William Merritt in Williamsburg. Well, Jefferson, who'd been there, was 8 years older. And over the course of the 8 years, there's been some changes. And William and Mary became what we call a party school. I mean, they didn't put a little Jamie going to a school where the professors were seen playing cards, and they were drunken in the streets, and this was not a good future for little Jamie to go to be William and Mary. Well, it just so happens that Thomas Martin, who was his tutor, was a graduate of a school in New Jersey. Anybody here from New Jersey? Okay, we got some New Jerseyites. Well, it was called the College of New Jersey, which we know as what? Princeton, okay? So, he went up there, now get this, but they didn't have any motorized vehicles. That's 300 miles from his home. So it took him 10 days on horseback. He and Thomas Martin, and one of the slaves, 10 days by horseback, 300 miles, all the way from Orange, Virginia, up to Princeton University. Now, just so happens, now he was up there in 1769, at the age of 16, actually 18. Just so happens the year before, in 1768, they had a new president, a distinguished Presbyterian pastor by the name of Reverend John Witherspoon, who was a great patriot. John Witherspoon, later years, some years later, would be the only ordained pastor to be a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And he was not only the president of the College of New Jersey, but he also taught classes on the Constitution and the different forms of government. So here was James Madison being immersed by an internationally famous Presbyterian pastor on the principles of government. He also learned to read in another language, Hebrew. And so now, in the early days, the colleges were primarily set up to train up pastors. And you know, the 13 colonies we had before we became our own country, up in New England, they were mostly Congregationalists in their Christian beliefs. In the Central States, they were Quakers and Presbyterians. Maryland was mostly Catholic. And they were Anglican in the southern states, including Virginia. Now, as part of the Anglican principles, you'll give honor to the king. Well, sometime later, King George III came into power. He was a tyrant. They didn't want to give any honor to King George III, so they didn't want to be committed as Anglican. They became Episcopalians. But interestingly enough, the official religion which you were obligated to join in Virginia was Episcopal. And there was a story that if you didn't have a license, you weren't allowed to preach. Now, how many of you here happen to be Baptists? Okay, anybody? A few hands went up. Okay, well, guess what? There's a little town called Culpeper in Virginia. There were some Baptists that decided they were going to preach, and they didn't have a license. And you know what happened? They were arrested and put into jail. Well, freedom of religion was something that was very troubling to James Madison. He felt very strongly about that. And he not only had a broad religious background from Reverend John Witherspoon, but he also was educated in the classics, the Greek and Roman classics. So he had a very broad education. He completed 3 years of service, of training in 2 years. As a matter of fact, he was such a diligent reader, he would stay up late at night reading as many books in different, remember he could read in now all these languages, okay? He also learned Spanish on top of that, so he could read and write in 7 different languages by the time he graduated from college. How many of our students today can do that, okay? I mean, you have to say, this is a brilliant man, and he had a brilliant future ahead of him. And so I'm going to start referring to my notes because I told my wife, I said, I can't possibly memorize all the details, but I did want to give you a verbal introduction. Now, after he came back from college, he had to decide what was the direction of his life. What was he going to do? Now, let's put this into context. Well, I forgot to tell you. He completed 3 years of education in 2 years. But he stayed up so late at night, he became physically ill with what? Bilious fever. And he was disabled. He couldn't make that 300-mile journey back to Orange, Virginia, where his home was. So he stayed another year as really the first graduate student of Princeton University. And he studied Hebrew. And so he was very familiar with the Bible, both the Old and the New Testament, because he could read in Greek and in Hebrew. So when he finally did return home, he was very well educated. So what was his future going to be? Well, remember this was 70, right in that range, early part of the 1770s. Remember we declared our independence in 1776. So what was going on before we declared our independence? Well, King George III had come into power. And he had a lot of troops stationed in America because remember we had the French and Indian War. The French were constantly trying to invade and the property, all the colonies were English, okay? And so we had battles with the French to keep them out of English territory. Well, that cost money to keep the troops here in America, and so he said, well, the colonists ought to be paying for that. So he introduced some taxes, the Townsend Acts, the stamp tax, and so on and so forth. He taxed tea. Remember, he had the Boston Tea Party up in Boston. And so the people didn't like this, and they pleaded with the Parliament and with King George III that, you know, we will do what we can, but we can't support all this revenue, and because we're not being fully represented. There were English governors in each state. Governor Densmore, I believe, was in Williamsburg. And so there was a lot of unrest. And the British understood there was some unrest, and they were concerned about that. So in Williamsburg, the Redcoats met and raided the armory. They took our gunpowder, they took our rifles and everything, and there was a big concern where they were disarming us. And they were threatening to do the same thing up in Boston. And so the Minutemen ran out in the Lexington and Concord to fend off the British from stealing their weapons, because that was their only defense against tyranny. Okay? So these are the events that were occurring just after Madison finished his college education. So he was very concerned about these events. And matter of fact, when the Congress met, the first Continental Congress met up in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia in 1774, they said we need to have what's called a committee of safety. And they wanted each organization, each country, each part of America, or the colonies at the time, to appoint people to serve a committee of safety, to fend off any attacks from the British. I mean, they were a real threat at that point. So Madison, that's how he first got involved. He was appointed to the Committee of Safety in Orange, Virginia. So let me continue from here. Did we get the pictures up? Oh, there we go. That's what James Madison looked like as a young man. Most of the pictures on there. Thank you, John Burry. You finally got it going. Okay. We'll be showing pictures here periodically, but let me continue here. Now, so, his future in politics seemed inevitable for Madison, who took a keen interest in the way governments functioned, particularly with the struggle between the American colonies and Great Britain. He was on the Committee of Safety in 1774. Then in October of 1775, was commissioned as a colonel in the Orange County Militia, although he never really served in the field. In May of 1776, he was elected to the House of Burgesses. Now this is equivalent to the Virginia State Legislature, except we had not declared our independence in May, so it was really our colonies at that point. So he headed to Williamsburg, in the capital, where the House of Burgesses met. And that's where he first met up with, guess who? His good long-term friend, Thomas Jefferson. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But his job was to work on the Virginia Declaration of Rights when he was in the House of Burgesses under George Mason. And also to work on a constitution for Virginia, because they could see what was happening. We were going to have to separate from England. We were no longer going to be British subjects. We were going to declare independence. Matter of fact, individual states were preparing their own Declaration of Independence, in addition to the one that we're familiar with, that Jefferson wrote, that Virginia and even North Carolina. Anybody hear of the Mecklenburg Declaration? Anybody? How about you North Carolinians? Okay, I see some nodding heads. You know, there's a story going around, I'm probably make people mad with this one. The people in North Carolina have written a Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, declaring their independence from England. And they claimed that their version of the Declaration of Independence was identical to that written by Thomas Jefferson. And they claimed that Jefferson stole their literature. Okay. And when they said, well, can you prove that? Says, well, you know, we don't have that Constitution around anymore. It was stored up in the attic and that house burned down. So we don't have any evidence to support it. So I don't know, take it or leave it. I don't know if to believe that one or not. But people still stand by it. Anybody still stand by that? Okay. I wonder if that's really true. But anyhow, let me finish on here. So one of the things was religious freedom. Remember I told you about the Baptist being arrested, and he witnessed this. And he said, so there was a Virginia Declaration of Rights, in addition to the Virginia State Constitution, similar to our Bill of Rights, right? See some similarities occurring here. So he was involved in that. Working with George Mason, one of the things was a right for religious freedom. And the first draft, now the draft that was written was worded this way, that all men should enjoy toleration in the exercise of religion according to their conscience. Well, Madison, who was strongly influenced by Witherspoon, felt the language should be changed to emphasize the freedom of religion rather than the tolerance of religion. So he proposed to read, all men are equally entitled to the full and free exercise of religion according to the dictates of their conscience. Well, a little problem here. Remember, the official religion in Virginia was Episcopalian, and they got voted down. That was too strong of a language. So he went back and he had to rewrite it to state the following. And this is in the Virginia Bill of Rights for the Virginia State Constitution. All men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, and that it is the mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. And that was the words that Madison wanted to put in there, and that is what's in there. So this was a big factor, and when he was a young man, you can see here. Oop, this is what he looked like. He was started his politics when he was late 20s, early 30s. Okay. All right. So now let's go on. In May of 1780, the Continental Congress was now meeting up in what we call Independence Hall, but at that time it was called the Pennsylvania State House. And so we had already declared independence. And as I mentioned, Reverend John Witherspoon was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So in 1780, Madison was asked to go to Philadelphia to serve as the Virginia delegate in the Second Continental Congress. And he was there from 1780 till the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. Now, and when we declared our independence, we had to put our own constitution together, and it was called the Articles of Confederation. Now remember, we had 13 colonies, and they were not only different in religion, but geographically they were separated, so there wasn't a lot of unity. And when they met, the first Continental Congress met in Carpenter's Hall in 1774, it says we need to be united against Britain, because they're disrupting us, they're not listening to us, and so that was why we had to be united. So once we were separated from Britain, we then became not colonies, but states. That's how we became the United States of America. But still, the states felt very sovereign about how they were going to do things, and so there was not a lot of agreement over things. And so when they put the Articles of Confederation together, It was a very, very weak central government and very strong state government. And the state governments, they made their own currency. Remember that each state had their own currency. They had their own trade policies, and trade was a big thing. Now, originally when we were colonies, Britain had a lot of manufacturing, and they prohibited America from manufacturing anything because it would be in competition with the companies in Britain. But we were a good source of natural resources. We had a lot of natural resources, timber and such. And so the trade that we had going on, we would send our natural resources to England and to France, and we would in turn buy the finished products from Europe, primarily Britain. So trade was a big part of our economy, okay? And we were also growing tobacco. We grew later on cotton and rice and so on. So Madison, working in the Continental Congress under the Articles of Confederation, found, now get this, does this sound familiar? It says, he discovered how conflicting state interests could affect a decision on national policy. He learned very quickly that votes in Congress turn less on careful arguments than on a variety of special interests. Sounds familiar. Madison quickly gained a reputation for bringing multiple interests together in coalitions. And as a member of Congress, Madison served on bodies exercising not only the legislative, but the executive and judicial functions. So he was now getting some experience in all three branches of government while he was up at the Continental Congress. Now, his involvement gave him the opportunity to see how each part worked. So he remained in Philadelphia till I mentioned September of 1783. Then he came back home. And he realized that his future probably lay in politics. So then he joined the Virginia Assembly, which was meeting in Richmond at that time. And he worked hard to convince his fellow delegates to pass bills favoring fiscal responsibility and pay the debts owed to France. Now remember, we had to get the aid of the French because when we declared our independence, our military was nothing but farmers and merchants. We had no navy, and England was a very large military force with a very big, strong navy, and Ben Franklin was over there in France trying to get them to help us in the war. And the turning point was the Battle of Saratoga, where we actually won a battle against the British. And at that point, the French decided they would come join us because they always wanted to fight the British. And it seems like the British and the French always were at each other's throats, and so they welcomed that opportunity. So anyhow, the unjust taxation from the British was still fresh in the minds of the American people. And the issues of currency and international trade led him to focus on national concerns. This is Madison during the Virginia Assembly. He seized every opportunity to highlight the blessings of strength and the perils of weakness in the federal union. His experience in Congress from 1780 to 1783 confirmed his conviction that the future glory of America required a stronger central government. The Articles of Confederation just were not working out, okay? So in 1786, Madison left Richmond and returned to his family home to pursue his interest in books and politics. And he watched the direction of the country under the Articles of Confederation, and he became alarmed. He said, we are doomed if we keep up this kind of a government. Now, remember, he was well read. He could read and write in 7 languages. So, let me just give you a little more background on the Articles of Confederation, some of the things that were principles here. Here it is. Each state had one vote. Didn't matter whether you were Delaware or Virginia or New York. Each state had one vote, regardless of the size. So Delaware had a lot of leverage. Same thing with other smaller states like Rhode Island. Congress did not have the power to tax. They had no money. Now get this. Here's General Washington out there fighting the British. He needs supplies. He needs boots for the men. He needs food. He needs ammunition. He writes a letter to Congress. Can you provide these supplies? Congress doesn't have any money. So they write a letter to the states. Can anybody help out General Washington? He's fighting a war, by the way, okay? And some did, and some didn't. Some didn't even send any money or any supplies. So, you know, this makes the fact that we defeated the British is even more of a miracle, because who would be fighting a war like this and have any chance of winning? But we did with the help of the French. Congress could requisition the states for money, but it couldn't compel compliance. They had no leverage over it, okay? There was no executive branch to enforce any acts passed by Congress. So Congress could pass acts, but there was nobody to enforce them. There was no national court system, so there was no justice. Amendments to the Confederation required a unanimous vote for all 13 states. Well, not likely to happen, you know. Major questions of war, peace, international relations, and finance required a 9 out of 13 majority in Congress to pass. Rarely did any agreements. And 2 delegates must be present for a state vote to be counted. And the poor and infrequent attendance meant few issues were addressed. This was the state of our government after we declared our independence. No wonder Madison was alone, okay? And on top of that, trade was the big issue. That was our major economic thing, okay? And states were fighting each other. Some were making deals with Britain. Well, we'll make a better deal for you. And that would be work against some of the other states that was also trying to make a deal. So they were convinced, they were negotiating trade agreements that mostly limited the other states in gaining revenue. Now, Madison was well informed in the working of government. He was convinced that America would be torn by faction unless the bonds of the Union were strengthened before it was too late. Madison felt strongly the need to be a nationwide control over commerce if the United States was to participate advantageously in international trade. The issue now, anybody hear of the Annapolis Convention? Did you know? Okay, I've got a hand over there. You know, there was a convention before the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. It was in, actually, Annapolis, Maryland, September of 1786, the year before the convention in Philadelphia. This is to be a convention of all 13 states to send delegates to discuss these issues with international trade and work out some agreement that was going to be workable. Well, guess what? Only New Jersey, Delaware, and Virginia sent delegates. None of the other colonies sent any delegates. Couldn't make any agreements. So this was without sufficient votes. They were unable to examine the trade of the states and consider a uniform system in their commercial regulations. The failure to establish any mutually agreeable trade agreements was a major factor leading to conclude the necessity of a national federal convention with all the states participating. Now, John Madison's back home. His good friend Thomas Jefferson is an ambassador of France. They both love books. He writes a letter to Jefferson saying, can you send books on government? So after a few months go by, a shipment of 200 books arrives at Montpelier. So received, and they were in Greek, French, Latin, and Italian. And these books discuss the pros and cons of experiments in republican or federal governments and confederacies. Madison, who was educated, was able to read and understand them, enabling him to ascertain the advantages and disadvantages of different forms of confederacies. He sought to identify the constitutional bonds and the way they work or fail in practice. He learned that chief among the faults, now get this, does this sound familiar? He learned that the chief among the faults were the jealousies and animosities amongst the members and the lack of sufficient central authority to arbitrate or to control them. He also found that the large cities awed and corrupted the will of the people in the rural areas. Everywhere, Madison found weak bonds of union among the people courted disaster. The result of his study left him well informed in the workings of Confederate governments and confirmed his conviction that the United States would be torn by faction unless it heeded the history of other nations
and strengthened their bonds of union before it was too late. Madison quickly realized the Articles of Confederation were going to fail to preserve the freedom and liberty that we fought so hard for our independence. So what happened? He started writing. He took all notes and put together what we now today call the Virginia Plan, which is a new type of federal government to replace the Articles of Confederation. This new government would have power divided between executive, legislative, and judicial branches, 3 branches. There would become a national government, giving the federal government authority over the individual states to promote the common good and support the general welfare of the people. Madison felt each state must forfeit some of its sovereignty in the process. The largely ceremonial role, by the way, here's a question. Who was the first president of the United States? This is a trick question. Anybody know? It wasn't George Washington. Okay. John Hanson. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was a president who was selected by the legislature to serve a term of 1 year. So you can amaze your friend and say, do you know who the first president of the United States was? It was John Hanson. You said, never heard of the guy. Well, you got to know your history, okay? So the first elected president of the United States was George Washington. That was after we had a new constitution. Have fun with that. Okay. Now he continued. The legislature would be bicameral, not unicameral, which was under the Articles of Confederation, and have an upper and lower house. Members of the lower house were to be elected by the people, and the upper house members were selected by the state legislatures. And the reason they did that is they felt the state legislatures would know who the best people were to serve in Congress, and they were the ones they wanted to place in the Senate. There was an amendment to the Constitution that changed that later, as we know. Okay, but that's the way it started out. Madison believed that individual states would know their statements, and okay, each of the states would be represented in proportion to the number of free inhabitants. States with large populations would thus have more representatives, and the lower house of the smaller states. And now here again, the executive, the president, would be chosen by the legislature. That was amended in the Constitution, okay? This is his proposal. Now, based upon the experience of what happened in Annapolis, he says, if we're going to have a convention, we're going to have more than 3 states show up. We've got to have all 13. So he figured how to do that. Well, remember, General Washington had won the war, and he was highly respected for that. Matter of fact, General Washington was the most highly respected man in the nation at that time. But he had served for all, he felt he had given his public service, and he had retired to his beloved Mount Vernon. He was a farmer, enjoyed being on his farm. And Madison wrote some letters to General Washington saying, would you serve as the chairman for this convention? Because if you're there, then the delegates will come. Well, guess what? Washington said, wasn't interested. He wanted to stay at his beloved Mount Vernon. So Madison made several visits to Mount Vernon by horseback, talking to General Washington, saying, would you please, sir, we are in dire straits. You've got to come and serve as the chairman of the Constitutional Convention. And after these discussions, Washington himself became alarmed and said, I will agree to do that. And matter of fact, he sent out a number of letters to people that he knew who he thought would be good delegates from each of the states to come. And lo and behold, 12 states sent representatives. There was one state that would. Anybody know what state that was? Yes. Rhode Island. Anybody here from Rhode Island? Nobody's familiar from Rhode Island. Yeah, Rhode Island, I thought it was a waste of time. They weren't going to send anybody to any convention. They were fine with the articles the way they were. They weren't going to have anything to do with it. So, anyhow, so here's what happened. They all met up in May of 1787, 12 states. And now, the way the delegates arrived at the convention in Philadelphia, it was their intention to fix the Articles of Confederation. That's all they wanted to do. They knew there were problems, and they were going to convene just to fix the Confederation. But Madison had a little different plan. Remember? He wanted to replace it altogether. Now, Madison didn't have a good speaking voice. He was a rather weak individual, a weak voice. He's not a good speaker. And after the convention started, he wanted to present his Virginia plan. Now, let me preface something. They met between May and September 1787 in Philadelphia in what we know is Independence Hall. No air conditioning. It turned out to be one of the hottest summers on record up there, okay? They wanted to have a secret meeting. They closed the doors and locked them, and they closed the windows and locked them. Now, can you imagine we're sending delegates, and we're going to have a new form of government, but we're not going to tell you anything about it until we're done, okay? The reason they wanted to do that is get this, they wanted to have a free and open discussion. They didn't want the public listening. They didn't want the press there reporting daily what's going on, calling them flip-flops because they changed their position on this or that. They wanted to be able to listen to reasoned arguments, to be convinced to go one way or the other. And that's why that was a secret meeting. Now, Madison, being so involved in this, he was diligently taking notes each day on all the discussions and who was arguing this way and who was arguing that way. And there was an agreement that those notes would not get published until the last of the delegates of that convention had died. That's how secret this was going to be. And that's what happened, okay? Now, each state received notification of the convention. And now, let me continue here. He then wanted to present his Virginia plan. There was a governor of Virginia by Edmund Randolph, who had a fine speaking voice. So he gave Edmund Randolph, who was the governor of Virginia, the Virginia plan. And he introduced it. Well, guess what happened? A lot of the delegates said, hey, we're not here to put a new government together. We're just here to fix the Articles of Confederation. So arguments ensued. Remember, the windows and doors were all closed. It was hot. The discussions got very heated over this. They were not about to change the Articles of Confederation to some other new government. And so anyhow, it went on that way. And eventually cooler heads prevailed, and they said, well, let's at least hear what he has to say. So they allowed the plan to be presented by Edmund Randolph. Well, after it was presented, the real problems with the government at that point existed because of the mixed character of mankind. Most believed there was sufficient virtue in men to form a government of freedom and liberty. Yet there was also greed, corruption, and ignorance required lawful restraints. The problem was to devise a government to take advantage of virtue and provide a protection against evil. You had to balance the two. Madison declared, now get this is one of his quotes, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. As such, there must be a means of controlling the force of government. But what is government itself but a reflection of human nature? How true, still true today, right? So, the Articles of Confederation vaguely recognized each state as sovereign over the affairs and laws of their individual state. Now, Hamilton from New York was a Federalist. George Mason from Virginia was an anti-Federalist, okay? So, George Mason favored a weak federal government, whereas Hamilton strongly wanted a stronger federal government. So, it goes on. So Madison stood between them, proposing a government incorporating the ideals of a virtuous republic, strong but representing the will of the people, and feeling that they were not only compatible but helpful to each other. The anti-federalists assumed that a republican government was just as oppressive as the monarch, thus missing the dimension of a large republic to protect against factions. Furthermore, the larger states like Pennsylvania, Virginia, by the way, Virginia as we know today, of course, West Virginia separated during the Civil War. but that used to be part of the state of Virginia. But Virginia used to extend through Ohio, all the way through Indiana and Illinois. I mean, it was a big state. It extended from the current border all the way up to the Great Lakes. So it had a lot of influence, okay? So Virginia and Massachusetts often competed unfairly with smaller states like Delaware, Rhode Island, Maryland, and New Jersey on issues of international trade, and I mentioned that before. So the small states didn't like this plan. So William Harrison, one of the delegates from New Jersey, was concerned with the sweeping changes proposed by the Virginia plan. He agreed the Articles of Confederation had difficulties, but perhaps adjustments or modifications could be made. He proposed an alternate called the New Jersey Plan. His plan was to retain the main elements of the Articles of Confederation and simply make changes to correct its main deficiencies. He wanted to retain a unicameral, one house, not two houses, legislature with equal votes for states, no matter whether large or small, and then have the national legislature elect the executive while adding power to raise revenue and taxes. The New Jersey Plan was designed to protect the security and power of the smaller states by limiting each state to one vote. Now here, Virginia goes all the way up to the Great Lakes, they got one vote, and Delaware also gets one vote. Same. So this wasn't going to fly, okay? This became a major point of contention at the convention, particularly the issue of equal rights. So it got voted down. Okay. Now, by mid-July, remember that it's a hot summer, the issue had become so contentious, the convention was teetering on the brink of dissolution. The delegates were suffering from both the heated debates and the oppressive heat of the sweltering Philadelphia summer. Some of the delegates left the convention in disgust. As a matter of fact, the entire New York delegation left. They said, we're not going to ever resolve this. And so the Union was about to break. Okay? The states were unwilling to give enough power to the sovereign rights of the federal government to function in the national interest. Within a few weeks, the debate over representation hopelessly deadlocked and grew increasingly bitter. Enter Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin, who was one of the delegates who had signed the Declaration of Independence, rose from his seat to give a speech that penetrated the hearts and the minds of the delegates. And I quote, this is Ben Franklin. In the beginning of the contest with Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. And have we now forgotten this powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I have lived a long time. He was in his 80s, okay? I have lived a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this. I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in the political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests. Our projects will be compounded, and we ourselves shall be a reproach and a byword down to the future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter, from this unfortunate instance, despair of establishing government by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, or conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayer, imploring the assistance of heaven, and the blessing on our deliberation be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. Franklin pleaded his fellow delegates not to let local partial interests destroy the convention. Now guess what? They voted it down. They originally voted it down, which said, Well, remember, this is a secret meeting of people outside seeing clergymen coming in. They might think something is wrong. And so but it was a sobering bringing them to reality as to what they were there for. And even though they didn't have a clergyman to come in for prayer, they took their business seriously. So after Franklin's speech, the delegates agreed to seek God's wisdom to overcome their impasse. Recognizing legitimate differences in their opinions, they soberly reflected on why they were there and what they needed to accomplish. Now, Roger Sherman rose to his feet. Connecticut. Anybody here from Connecticut? Nobody here from Connecticut? Okay. Anybody here from New England? One. Massachusetts, sorry. The story goes on. Roger Sherman from Connecticut proposed what was later to refer to as the Great Compromise. Sherman proposed the creation of a bicameral two-house legislature, with the states having equal representation in the upper house or Senate, and the people having proportional representation in the lower house. Sounds familiar? While all money bills were to originate in the lower house. Sounds familiar? The lower house should be populated with members representing a percentage of the population of each state. The members of the lower house were then elected by the people, and the upper house members selected by the state legislatures. That's like under the Articles of Confederation. This way, a fair government would contain representatives in proportion to the population. Finally, the convention delegates agreed on creating a House of Representatives apportioned by population, and the Senate in which each state had equal votes, no matter the size. Additionally, the plan proposed that the legislative branch would have the power to veto state laws if they were deemed incompatible with the Articles of the Union, or the states were deemed incompetent. How about that? Madison firmly believed the strongest foundation of a government was provided by the role of the people. He most feared greedy, unchecked minority oppressing everyone. Okay? Madison lectured the convention about the problem of constructing a proper Senate. It must be prevented from betraying its trust, yet have great power to stand for wisdom and virtue, as opposed to the fickleness and the passion of the lower house. And that was the whole idea. The upper house of the Senate was to have, they served 6 years, and the House of Representatives only 2 years. And the House were people that were voted by the people. And they had all kinds of wild ideas, but the Senate had their members chosen by the individual state legislatures, and these are supposedly men with wisdom. And that was the balance between the two branches of Congress. Now, another point of discussion was the power of the individual heading the executive branch. There was concern over the tyranny of a ruler like they experienced under King George III. Some of the delegates proposed the legislature electing the president, but Madison opposed it as there would be insufficient separation of powers, and factions may have an undue influence, so the independence of the executive from the legislature denomination was absolutely essential. They did not want Congress choosing the president because of the separation of powers, okay? After considerable discussion, the delegates agreed the biggest threats, now get this, the biggest threats to the people were the acts of the legislature, sounds familiar, not the acts of the executive. A check against the legislative power was proposed where the executive would have veto power over the acts of the legislature. It was soon realized that any branch could be a source of tyranny, so there should be checks on each branch against the acts of another. This resulted in a proposal for the legislature to overcome the presidential veto by 2/3 of the majority. Well, at this point, the delegates finally agreed to the form and content of the Constitution. But then the issue of slavery came up. The southern states had more slaves than the white population, and they wanted to have slaves counted as people to increase their representation in the lower house of Congress. But the northern states balked at this. They said, that's not the way we want this. And so there was a go-between on this whole subject. And finally it was agreed that there would be what was called the 3/5 clause. They would account 3 of the slaves, 3 out of the 5 slaves as people. But remember, slaves were not considered people during those days. They were considered property. They bought and sold. So this was quite a bit of a compromise on the part of the Northerners to at least agree to this point. Now they're able to move forward. But within the Constitution, slavery was an issue that the northern states really struggled with. They said it's unjust to be treating people as slaves. However, they realized the reality is if they had eliminated slavery in the Constitution, there would be no votes from the southern states, and there would be no Constitution. So they decided that the only way they could do that is to come up with another compromise, and that was that there would be a 20-year period in which the importation of slavery would be allowed, but after that, it would be illegal to import slaves. So in our Constitution, there's a provision by 1808 that it would be illegal to import more slaves. Now, all right, so now they have agreed to sign the Constitution. However, it would not take effect until it was ratified by 9 of the 13 states. And so each state had to elect delegates, hold a convention, review the new Constitution, and vote on it. And so each state had that. Now, because the delegates, many of the delegates at these state ratifying conventions were not part of this secret meeting in Philadelphia, they didn't know what this Constitution was all about. And so that's what prompted something called the Federalist Papers. There were 85 articles published primarily in the New York papers called the Federalist Papers, which defined the nature of the Constitution in great detail. And this would give the delegates and the general public better information as to just what this new Constitution. And there were 85 articles and essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. And they explained the principles of the Constitution, and Madison wrote 29 of them, John Jay wrote 5, and Hamilton wrote 51. They were published under the name Publius. And the first 77 were published in the Independent Journal, in the New York Packet, and the Daily Advertiser between October of 1787 and April of 1788. Now, John Jay wrote his 5 articles before he suffered from a severe attack of rheumatism, and it was which incapacitated him. He was able to write any more than the 5. So those were the ones that were discontinued, actually, by John Jay. 3 of Hamilton's essays concern the dangers from dissensions between the states. 3 on the effect of the economy and revenue. 3 on the inability of the present Confederation to preserve the Union. 7 on the power of taxation. 6 on judicial authority. 7 on the executive branch, and 5 on the powers for the common defense. These were the focus of Hamilton's essays. Madison's 29 essays, 3 were concerned the insufficiency of the present Confederation to preserve the Union. 4 were on the importance of conformance to the Republican principles and the structure of government. Now, we're not going to go through all 85 tonight, but I thought we'd go through a few of them just to give you some sense of what they were. Federalist Number 1, written by Hamilton, set the debate in broad political terms to decide whether large societies of men are really capable of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever dependent upon political constitutions and constitutions by accident and force. Hamilton states that a pure democracy could not work, but a large number of states, each with a Republican form of government, with federal representations from each state, is the best choice. Now, one of the most famous essays is Federalist Number 10, written by Madison. The paper addresses the question of how to reconcile citizens with the interests contrary to the rights of others, and to serve the community as a whole.
Madison saw factions as inevitable due to the nature of man. That is, as long as people hold different opinions and have different amounts of wealth and have different amounts of property, they will continue to form alliances with people who are most similar to them, and they will sometimes work against the public interest and infringe upon the rights of others. So the question is how to guard against this. And so here Madison argues that one of the most conspicuous advantages of the new Constitution is the tendency to break up and control the violence of factions. There are two methods of removing the faction. One is by destroying liberty, which is essential to its existence. The other by giving every citizen the same options or opinions, the same passions and the same interests. So Madison saw the Constitution as forming a happy combination of a republic and a democracy, resulting in a decentralized government structure. And that's one of the main focuses of Federalist 10. A lot of people quote that. Also, Federalist Number 46 by Madison addressed the fears that the federal government would become too powerful, how about that, and too similar to the monarchy in Great Britain. Madison warned that America could resist an oppressive government because of the advantage of being armed. How about that? The people would be able to form a militia consisting of citizens to fight for their rights and their liberties. The advantages of being armed, which America possesses over the people of most every other nation, forms a barrier against tyranny. And he stressed that the federal and state governments have differing powers and that both are subject to the ultimate control of the people, the voters. Federalist Number 47, in this essay, Madison felt strongly the power must be divided between the branches to prevent factions from gaining too much control. So hence the three branches of government. Madison went on to argue that absolute power wielded by tyrants would be far more dangerous than a Republican dispersal of power into the hands of the people. Madison felt strongly that government by the consent of the people was more realistic and morally preferable. When he was a student at the College of New Jersey under John Witherspoon, John Witherspoon taught a class called Introduction of Government in his lectures. He said the best government, this is what Witherspoon taught, best government is one where everyone has his power to act virtuously and to live happily. And he admired George Washington for being a good example of those virtues. Federalist Number 57, in this essay, Madison addressed the issue of people electing suitable men for office for the House of Representatives. And he said, to obtain rulers, men who possess the most wisdom to discern and the most virtue to pursue the common good of the society. I'm not sure we followed that as well as we should, but that's what his principles were. Meanwhile, Delaware, so each of the states held their ratifying conventions. Delaware had one in December, and they were the first state to hold a convention to ratify the Constitution on December 7th, 1787. Matter of fact, if anybody's seen the license plate of Delaware, it says first state. They're proud of being the first state to ratify the Constitution. Second state was Pennsylvania. They also ratified it in December and went on in this order. Third one was New Jersey, also in December. So those three states were in December. Georgia in January, Connecticut in January as well. Massachusetts by February, Maryland April 28th, South Carolina in May 23rd, and New Hampshire was the 9th state. That's all they needed, the 9 out of the 13 states to ratify it. On June 21st, 1788, New Hampshire's delegation of their convention ratified the Constitution. And it was great celebration because we now had a ratified Constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. However, that was only 9 states. There were several more states that were still to hold their ratifying convention. Now, remember the Federalist Papers. They were written to support the ratification. And New York was one of the states that had not ratified yet, and most of these articles were being published in New York. So the Federalist Papers became a big factor with the delegates in New York and the other states as well. Now comes Virginia's ratifying convention. Now remember, Virginia was the largest state. It was the home state of James Madison. And he was a delegate at his own ratifying convention. However, it was a very rough time. And the reason for that is there was a man by the name of Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, and others, and guess what? Edmund Randolph turned against him. He said he didn't think he was going to ratify this Constitution because it didn't include a Bill of Rights. And his good friend George Mason, remember he worked with George Mason in the, earlier on in the Virginia ratification or Virginia State Constitution and written the Bill of Rights for the Virginia State Constitution. George Mason agreed with the others that said he didn't want to ratify this Constitution unless it had a Bill of Rights. And so there were some things that held back Virginia from ratifying, and particularly the most upsetting thing was the fact that Patrick Henry was strongly opposed. And so Patrick Henry spoke, and he was a great speaker, much more so than Madison, who, remember I said he had a very weak voice and not a good speaking voice. And so here at this ratified convention in Virginia, Patrick Henry was railing against this was a bad constitution, we shouldn't vote on it, and he was having a great deal of influence over the delegates and their decision whether Virginia would actually ratify this constitution. And here's little Jimmy Madison sitting here listening to this, and he was overcome with another attack of bilious fever, and he had to retire to his home for several days to recover. But when he finally got well enough, he returned to the convention. But you know, he had done his homework. He had all the facts. And he took the argument that Patrick Henry had dismantled his argument point by point and convinced the large number of the delegates at that convention that the things that Patrick Henry was most concerned about were not really going to happen.
He stood up and says, I have observed that gentlemen suppose, this is Madison, that the general legislature will do every mischief they possibly can, and they will admit to do every good thing which they are authorized to do. If this was a reasonable supposition, their objections would be good. I consider it reasonable to conclude that they will as readily do their duty as to deviate from it. Nor do I go on. The grounds mentioned by gentlemen on the other side, Patrick Henry, that we are in a place of unlimited confidence in them and expect nothing but the most exalted integrity and sublime virtue. But I go on this great Republican principle that the people will have virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom. Is there no virtue amongst us? If there be not, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty and happiness without any virtue in the people is not a workable idea. If there be sufficient virtue and intelligence in the community, it will be exercised in the selection of these men so that we do not depend upon their virtue or put confidence in our rulers, but in the people who are to choose them. No state except one in which the people have supreme power provides habitation for liberty. When I worked at Montpelier, in the old library, when we took the tour in there, these quotes were on the wall, what he had said. And we made sure everybody heard them, okay? Madison was asking the states to give up power for the good of the whole nation. The people must consent to the government, yet the people must maintain a direct influence over their government through popular representation. Madison believed that an informed, engaged citizenry, I can't say that, was critical to preserving our republic. So the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty. I'll say that again. The advancement and diffusion of knowledge, true knowledge, is the only guardian of true liberty. Okay, so finally on June 25th, 1788, Virginia voted. 89 in favor and 79 opposed. Only 10 votes in favor of ratifying. And if it had been the other way, Virginia wouldn't be part of the United States. That's how close it was. Okay, now, New York had its ratifying convention. Well, what happened there? Well, now remember, a lot of these Federalist Papers were written and published in New York to convince the New York delegates. New York's an important state. Now, here, Hamilton was adopted to the New York ratifying convention. He was a Federalist. Hamilton was. Many of the other delegates were anti-Federalists and were strongly opposed to ratification. Now, the New York anti-Federalists were against approval unless certain agreements were accepted by a specific date. In large part, the ratification by New York was uncertain because of strong opposition from the former New York governor, George Clinton. Now get this. Their convention was in early June. When New Hampshire ratified it, it was nationwide interest. Thousands of people in New York City celebrated Virginia's ratification with a grand parade and a feast of food and beer. Showed the people were in favor of the Constitution, but their representatives wanted to vote against it. How about that one? Okay. So New York self-seeking politicians in the legislatures were reluctant to ratify. After much debate, New York ratified the Constitution in July 1788, realizing failure to ratify would leave New York out of the United States. The vote was 31 in favor and 29 against. Two votes. Who knew? I mean, is history interesting or not? Okay, now, how about North Carolina? What happened there? Well, remember, everybody else had already ratified, so their convention started July 21st. They proposed 20 changes to the Constitution. They had a Bill of Rights that was 21 sections. They started discussing it. Oh, they had 26 amendments. They adjourned a few weeks later, August 4th. They did not reconvene for another year. Meanwhile, votes went on. Government was formed. They were electing the president and members of Congress. And North Carolina still was trying to decide whether they were even going to vote. So they finally did come together a year later. And in July of 1789, by adding the Declaration of Independence as a provision, and they voted to ratify the Constitution. By that time, 11 other states had already ratified, and George Washington had already been elected President of the United States. Okay. Now, how about Rhode Island? Had a history of opposing federal measures, and there were reports of violent opposition to ratifying the Constitution. Nearly a dozen conventions failed and had been called in Rhode Island to ratify, so they had a dozen call to ratify, and every meeting failed in Rhode Island, often by wide margins. Now get this, a force of 1,000 country party supporters descended on Providence, Rhode Island on July 4th, 1788, to break up the celebrations of New Hampshire's ratification. So the same thing that happened in New York happened in Rhode Island. The people were celebrating the ratification signing by New Hampshire, and what did the politicians in Rhode Island do? They sent down armed men to break them up. Where is the freedom of the people in Rhode Island? On May 18th, 1790, the United States passed a bill that would ban all trade with Rhode Island unless they ratified the Constitution. Okay. So there. They would effectively be isolated from the Union. So finally, the General Assembly in Rhode Island capitulated 11 days later and ratified the Constitution. They dragged them by their heels. Okay. Now, With the successful ratification of the Constitution, the government of the United States began operation in March of 1789. They had elections. Madison was elected to the House of Representatives. Actually, Washington was inaugurated in Federal Hall in New York, but a short time later they moved the government to Philadelphia. And that's where Madison was spending time. Now, let me briefly, let's talk about one more thing. When Madison, one of his first chores, when he became a member of the House of Representatives, is to fulfill the request on the part of the delegates of the Ratifying Convention to add a Bill of Rights. So he collected from all the states what they would like to see as the Bill of Rights. And there was something like 100 of these things, okay? And they discussed it and boiled it down to 12. So the Congress agreed that, okay, we'll add 12 amendments to the Constitution, but they had to go around each of the states to be ratified. Well, guess what? Only 10 got approved. 2 of them didn't make it. Well, one of them was one of the 2 that didn't make it was changing the amount of representation for each state, and it was just gone by the wayside because the population was changing so rapidly, it became a moot point. But the 12th one was that Congress could no longer vote a pay raise while they were in office. It didn't get voted on. But guess what? It's now the 27th Amendment of the Constitution. It was ratified in 1992. So the amendment that didn't get voted on back in 1789 eventually became the 27th Amendment of the Constitution. Why it took so long, I don't know. Anyhow, one more thing. What's the difference between a Republican form of government and a Democratic? We use those terms interchangeably. And let me define it. A republic is a representative form of government where citizens are elected by the people to make decisions based upon the best interests of the people they represent. A democracy is a form of government where citizens elected by the people administer the government to impose the interest of the majority on the minority without any checks upon their power. The democracy always results in contention and turbulence, is incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and is generally short-lived and experiences violent death. The Republican form of government allows public views to be considered by their elected representatives whose wisdom may best discern the best true interest of their country, and whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary and partial considerations. Power is divided up among several bodies with checks and balances to the power of each body. So we have a republic, not a democracy. Now, here's little Jimmy Madison. He's 43 years of age. He fell in love with a woman named, I forgot her name, Kathy, but you need to remember her name. I don't remember her name. Anyhow, there was a young lady that they fell in love, and he was actually engaged, but she broke off the engagement. So here he's busy in the House of Representatives, and meanwhile, Dolly Madison, she wasn't Madison, her name was Dolly Payne. Let me give a little background. Dolly was born in North Carolina. She was Quaker, and her father was a planter and a slaveholder. And because he was a Quaker and he was a slaveholder, was inconsistent with the Quaker beliefs, and he was forced to sell his slaves. He moved his family up to Philadelphia and tried to start a business, but he wasn't a businessman, and his business failed, which was there's a lot of Quakers up in Philadelphia at the time, and so he went bankrupt. And the Quaker community forced him out of their community because they didn't want anybody that failed in business. So her mother, Dolly's mother, was forced to open a boarding house to pay for the family. And one of the men staying in her boarding house was Aaron Durham. This is in Philadelphia. So Aaron Durham got to know Dolly over the years. Meanwhile, Dolly had an arranged marriage. Okay, she was introduced to John Todd, a prosperous attorney, and after a short courtship, he asked her to marry him, and Dolly soon gave birth to 2 sons, Payne and William. That was in 1790. 3 years later, in Philadelphia, was stricken by a yellow fever epidemic, and over 5,000 people died in Philadelphia alone from the disease. Men, women, and children were dying at the rate of 100 a day. And Dolly Payne Todd lost her husband, her infant son William, and his parents, all within a week or so, leaving her a widow with a little 2-year-old, Payne. So, Aaron Burr arranged for Dolly to meet James Madison. And so, she was 26, James was 43, 17-year difference. She was a Quaker, he's an Episcopalian. Well, they did get married because she married out of the Quaker faith. She was forced out of the Quaker discipline. I don't know if she became an Episcopalian or what, but anyhow, even with their big difference in age, she said it was a happy marriage. And it was mainly because her son now had a father. And that was the big thing that she wanted. But, Quakers dress very simply. And Dolly loved to get dressed up. And so, now, at the time, when Jefferson became a president, the first president was Washington, then Adams, and then in 1800, Jefferson became president. Madison's been with Congress. Jefferson and Madison had a long-term relationship. Jefferson was a free thinker. He had great philosophy and grand ideas, but some of them weren't really practical. But Madison was the thinker. And so they would discuss their ideas, and Madison said, well, have you considered this or you considered that? And Jefferson respected Madison a lot, even though there were 8 years difference. Jefferson 8 years older. And Jefferson was like over 6 feet tall, and here's little Jimmy Madison, 5'6". But they became lifelong friends, and when Jefferson became president, he asked Madison to become Secretary of State. But interestingly enough, his wife Martha had died before he became president, so there was no first lady. So who do you have with parties? Well, here's little Dolly. Here's Dolly Madison up there. She'll all have parties, okay? And so she substituted for Martha, who had died, acted as the first lady for Jefferson. And then after Madison was elected, she became the real first lady. She initiated the Inaugural Ball, the thing that we do every election now. That was her idea. And let me read about this. Let's see. All right. Madison was inaugurated on March 4th, 1809, and Dolly was the star of the Inaugural Ball, with her fashionable velvet dress, a fancy bonnet of purple velvet, white satin, and white plumes. In contrast, James wore plain black clothes, with his hair dressed in old-fashioned style. It was Dolly first established the Inaugural Ball, and she was the center of the social life in Washington. Okay? Now, and Dolly was involved in her role, she discarded the somber Quaker dress when she married James. And so that's the beginning of that. Now, so here, little Jimmy is now president. And there was something going on. There was something called the Napoleonic Wars. Here again, the French and the British were at war with each other. And meanwhile, our economy was based upon trade. We had commercial shipping, so we were doing trade with France and with England. Okay, and sailing, they didn't have motorized vehicles, so they were depending upon sails to go across the Atlantic Ocean. And it took several months. So if you're a sailor, and when you finally arrive in port after being at sea for 2 months, where do you think they go? the nearest bar, right? Well, guess who happens to also be in that nearest bar? British sailors in the British military, the British Navy. Well, guess what? They start talking, well, what's the grub like on your ship? What's the pay like? And the pay and the grub was really bad on the British ships, but it was really good on the American ships. So guess what happened? All of a sudden, a lot of the British sailors were on the American ships. Well, the British government got wind of that. They said, we can't have this. So anytime they saw on the American trading vessels in the open sea, they came on board and took everybody off that had a British accent, saying, you have left, and it's called, they impressed. They impressed. And many of these were Americans. So what happened? This started during Jefferson's presidency, actually. So Jefferson, you know what his solution was? Okay, we're cutting off all the trade. The embargo, he had a trade embargo, so no American ships were going to go out to the sea to be captured by the British ships and have our sailors taken off and sent into the service for the British Navy. So that's the end of that. Well, guess what happened? The whole economy of New England was based upon trade. And they were violently opposed to this embargo. And as I was telling John this afternoon, who was the first state that threatened secession from the Union? Massachusetts. Massachusetts threatened to secede from the Union because their economy was in a tailspin because Jefferson had put an embargo on all trade. Well, when Madison now becomes president, he decides that's not going to work. So he tries to make peace agreements, plead with the British. Everything is turned down. British think, hey, we've got America on their heels. We're going to do whatever we want. We're going to enjoy all the privileges of being a more powerful country. So what did Madison do? He declared war on Britain. We declared war on Britain, okay? And that was the War of 1812. What happened? Now listen to this. Congressional efforts to build up the Army proved nearly impossible. The recruits were scattered about the frontier and were either aging veterans of the Revolutionary War or officers inexperienced except in Indian fighting. The American Navy less than 1/6 of the British warships. Madison's most vexing problem was to find suitable military leadership. His only choices in military commanders were elderly officers from the Revolutionary War. One of them, named Henry Dearborn, suffered an incapacitating illness, earning him the nickname Granny, and was dubbed the Generalissimo of the Terrapin Army. This was one of our generals. To compound the issues with Great Britain, in February of 1811, American spies discovered that American spies discovered British documents proving they had conspired with disloyal New Englanders to embarrass the American government. It's called British collusion, okay? In order to prevent war, they tried to convince the New Englanders to dissolve the Union, which had severely weakened America at a critical time. So the British were trying to break up our Union. Okay, the discovery was electric, charging a foreign power with intrigue to break up the Union, only further enraged the Americans, leaving the alternatives. The war was virtually gone. Okay, now, first importance of the impressments, we've got to stop that. And American citizens were being dragged on the foreign field. The war, okay, Congress declared war with the House voting 79 to 49 for war and the Senate voting 19 to 13. The War of 1812 was not only with Great Britain, but with the British colony of Canada and Native American Indian tribes who were supported by Britain. William Harrison, the governor of the Indian Territories, had made oppressive treaties with the Indians for 100 million acres of their hunting lands. Most Indians believed their only hope of stemming further encroachments by American settlers to ask them to join up with the British to oppose us. The Shawnee war chief Tecumseh sought to unite the Indian tribes in the Great Lakes region to resist the American government taking over their lands. By the fall of 1811, Tecumseh had organized a confederacy of Indian tribes. In response, Harrison organized a 1,000-man army to attack Tecumseh before he gained too much power. The Indians were alarmed at this development and started an early morning attack at Tippecanoe River, inflicting many casualties on Harrison's army. Harrison's army men rallied to thwart the raid and overcame the Indians. Meanwhile, British General Brock allied with the Indians and chose Indian Chief Tecumseh to lead their tribes to attack on our fort in Detroit. Meanwhile, our aging American commander, William Howe, had a phobia about Indians that prevented him from conducting campaigns against the British forces in Canada because of the British alliance with the Indians. Hull, deathly afraid of the savage behavior of the Indians, threw down his arms and collapsed in a spasm of fear and indecision. Hull capitulated to the British General Brock, and 2,000 of his men were taken captive to the Northwest Territory, abandoned by the Indian and British domination, dealing a shocking blow to America's morale. Some called Commander Hull a gasconading bully and a horrible coward. 4,500 British troops sailed up to Chesapeake Bay and anchored 35 miles from Washington. On August 22nd, when the news reached Washington, Secretary of State Monroe, who is now Secretary of State, ordered his men to secure the books and papers of the State Department, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the official records of the Continental Congress, and all the statutes were placed hastily in bags, loaded on the carts, and taken across the chain bridge into Virginia. Fearing the documents were still unsafe, they hired horses and wagons and transported them to Leesburg, Virginia, where they were stored in a house, and they were locked for safekeeping. Armstrong still insisted the British would attack Baltimore, but the British troops instead marched towards Ladensburg, Maryland, only 15 miles from Washington. Madison then ordered troops in Virginia to move towards Ladensburg. That night, Madison rode out on horseback to visit the troops and learned that the British were planning to move into Washington. He sent a note to Dolly to be prepared to leave the city on a moment's notice. The next morning, August 23rd, he returned to Washington and sent Secretary of State Monroe out to determine the British position. A short time later, Madison received from Monroe that the British were in full march towards Washington. On August 24th, almost twice as many American as British troops were on the field, but the American troops were undisciplined and ill-armed and positioned so badly that the British easily defeated them. The American army was soon in a hasty retreat, while the British headed into Washington. Madison watched anxiously until it became clear that the battle was lost. Meanwhile, Dolly was expecting the military officers in the cabinet for dinner. So she set the table and had everything ready. At midday, she looked out the window and saw people fleeing the city. So it was time to leave. So she had her servants remove the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of General Washington, the velvet curtains, some of the silverware, and the cabinet papers, and prepared to flee the city. Dolly apparently realized the importance of removing General Washington's portrait, since Washington was largely responsible for the British defeat in the Revolutionary War, and the British capture of his famous painting would be a valuable war prize. Late afternoon, Madison hurriedly returned to Washington, only to find that Dolly had left earlier that afternoon, leaving the White House deserted. After entering Virginia, he fled to Virginia, rode around Great Falls. The next day they met up. Meanwhile, the British boldly marched into Washington, unresisted by any military. The troops first set the Library of Congress on fire by igniting the books, and then proceeded to set fire to the Capitol and many other government buildings. Finally, they arrived at the White House around dinner time. British Admiral Cotton Burke sat down and had dinner, and had toast, and the president ordered his men to torch the house. In short order, the White House was engulfed in flames and smoke. A short time later, a violent thunderstorm hit Washington, extinguishing the fires and causing Britain's gunpowder to get so wet that they were unable to fire their guns. The next day, the British left Washington and returned to the ships. Encouraged by the capture and destruction of Washington, the British headed north towards Baltimore. Baltimore was far more important than Washington because of its strategic seaport and shipbuilding activity. British hoped the loss of both Washington and Baltimore would cripple the American war effort and force a peace strongly in favor of Great Britain. In early September, the British ships headed up the Chesapeake to Baltimore. But Baltimore, unlike Washington, contained formidable defenses, particularly guarding the harbor. Central to this defense was Fort McHenry, which guarded the inner harbor. The British landed a large military force near the fort in mid-September. The Americans had assembled a large force with cannons blocking the main road to Baltimore. British Major General Ross attacked the American positions, and the defenders held their positions, inflicting heavy casualties and killing General Ross, the British general. The British forces retreated to regroup under Colonel Brooke, and the British naval commanders realized they must neutralize Fort McHenry before they could reach Baltimore Harbor. On the night of September 13th, a British fleet of 19 warships attacked Fort McHenry with exploding mortar, shells, bombs, and rockets. The ammunition used in these ships would inspire the famous lines in our national anthem, and the rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting in air. Early in the morning of September 14th, the fort lowered their battle-storm flag and raised a large garrison flag. Francis Scott Key, a Washington lawyer, had come to Baltimore to negotiate the release of a civilian prisoner of war. He was held aboard a British warship 8 miles from Fort McHenry, where he witnessed the bombardment. The British rockets illuminated the large garrison flag that was flying over the fort. When he saw the flag in the dawn of September 14th, he was so moved that he wrote down a poem called The Defense of Fort McHenry, which later be set to a tune of a British drinking song. The song would later be renamed the Star-Spangled Banner. And 116 years later, in 1931, it became our national anthem. Now, even though only one British warship received a direct hit from the fort's cannon fire, the British realized they could not get past the fort to attack Baltimore and retreated and called off the attack. Finally, the British defeat at Baltimore would be a major factor in both sides reaching a peace agreement later that year. Meanwhile, the British war with France and Napoleon ended. Okay? Now, the British merchants demanded to reopen trade with America. But their attempts failed. Now, get this. Great Britain and America sent delegations to a neutral site in Ghent, Belgium. And the negotiations concluded on December 24, 1814, when a final peace agreement was signed, noted, and as they treated again. Now get this. This was in December of 1814. Meanwhile, Madison had sent Andrew Jackson to New Orleans. He didn't know about the peace agreement. Meanwhile, the British commanders in the Navy were also headed to New Orleans. They didn't know that the peace agreement had been signed. So when they arrived in, the British general was killed in the attack, leaving his men in turmoil. Okay, here. Let me read this. The British fleet soon arrived and disembarked 5,300 troops. At dawn of January 8th, the British advanced across an open field in the traditional rank and file and were torn to pieces by the American artillery and Tennessee riflemen who were protected by earthworks. British General Putnam, flanking the attack, miscarried and his main force was shattered. British General Pakenham was killed in the attack, leaving the men in turmoil with 300 British killed, 1,250 wounded, and 500 British captured from the captured cannons from the military invasion of New Orleans. There's a little history for you, okay? Anyhow, let me finish up here. Finally, Madison retired. Okay. Meanwhile, after all of this, Madison had troubles at home. Dolly never disciplined her son Payne Todd. Let's get a picture. John Payne Todd, he ran wild. He was a difficult child and showed little interest in pursuing his studies. As a young man, he was handsome and dashing, charming the belles of Washington, becoming like an American prince. Payne eventually became a compulsive gambler and alcoholic. His enormous gambling debts became a financial drain on William and James and Dolly. As an adult, he was belligerent and was repeatedly convicted of shooting incidents and sentenced to serve jail time for assaults and disruptions of the peace. Twice he was sent to debtor's prison. Madison had to cover much of his debts and bail bonds by mortgaging the house. Meanwhile, talk about a happy life, okay? Not only did his commanders fail, but now at home, his stepson is disruptive and ran up enormous debt. In March 1817, Madison retired from the presidency and returned to Montpelier. At his retirement, he had the applause of the nation. His popularity soared as a result of his stately conduct during the War of 1812. Madison had many factions objecting to him and his administration during his 2 terms as president, yet as he was retiring, some of his opposition praised him, pronouncing him a great man. Private and public tributes poured in for the retiring chief executive. Madison's wisdom and firmness had rescued America from the tempest of war and will be remembered with gratitude that he had wielded the sword without sacrifice of civil and political liberty. The paper wrote that no statesman could have a more honorable, more grateful termination of his official life than which crowned the administration of James Madison. Madison replied by expressing his pleasure at such sentiments from those he never expected a response. He left the country in a more flourishing situation at the end of his administration. John Adams, a Federalist, wrote, Jefferson, notwithstanding 1,000 faults and blunders, Madison has acquired more glory and established more union than all 3 predecessors, Washington and Jefferson and Adams, put together. Now I know it's running late, but when we stop at this point? Okay, well, let me see a show of hands. I have 1 page on slavery, which I wanted to cover because I thought there might be some questions. Consider reality. If you're ready to leave, thank you for coming. If you want to stay to hear the last section on slavery, you're welcome to stay. Let's finish up. Is that all right? Is that a reasonable proposal? Okay. If you would like to leave, you're welcome to do so. I thank you for coming. I hope you learned something about American history.